the fall of 1979, a crew of 3 men vanished from Harlem. They were ghosts swallowed by the city after a daring heist at a mob-run nightclub. They took with them nearly $1 million, a fortune at the time, and disappeared so completely it was as if they had never existed at all. Their names were Leo Russo, Marcus Jones, and Sammy Goldstein. For 45 years, their fate remained one of New York's most enduring underworld mysteries, a cold case wrapped in rumor and fear. The families they left behind were given no answers, no bodies, and no justice. The police had no crime scene, no witnesses, and no official report. The case was a perfect void. 45 years later, a hurricane would tear through the city, and in the wreckage of a condemned building, a demolition crew would make a chilling discovery. A discovery inside a sealed wall that would finally reveal the horrifying truth of what happened on that Harlem night, proving that some secrets cannot be buried forever. Leo Russo was a man built of contradictions. He had the calloused hands of a construction worker but the meticulous mind of an architect, a nickname he'd earned for his flawlessly designed heists. He wasn't a glamorous gangster or a violent thug. He was a provider, first and foremost. Leo saw the world in blueprints and weak points, a skill he'd honed during years of legitimate, back-breaking labor on the city's skyscrapers. But the pay was slow, and the dream he held for his family felt perpetually out of reach. That dream was embodied by his wife, Maria, a woman whose faith in him was both his greatest strength and his heaviest burden. And then there was their daughter, Sarah, a bright-eyed 6-year-old who was the center of his universe. His ambition wasn't for power or infamy. It was for a quiet house in the suburbs, a yard for Sarah to play in, and the peace of mind that came with leaving the criminal life behind for good. This job, the Starlight Lounge job, was meant to be his masterpiece and his exit. He'd spend nights at the kitchen table, long after Maria and Sarah were asleep, poring over salvaged schematics of the club. He wasn't just planning a robbery, he was mapping out their future. He once found Sarah looking at a picture book about horses, her finger tracing the outline of a white pony. He knelt beside her and whispered a promise that one day she would have one of her own. That promise echoed in his mind with every risk he calculated. It was the fuel for his audacity. He was a careful man doing a dangerous thing for the most ordinary of reasons: love. His life wasn't defined by crime, but by the family he was trying to save with it. His right hand was Marcus Jones, a man who rarely spoke but whose presence filled a room. Nicknamed Quiet Jones, he was the crew's muscle and lookout, a decorated Vietnam veteran who had come home from the jungle only to find a different kind of war on the city streets. The war had left him scarred, not with visible wounds but with a deep-seated silence and an aura of watchfulness that never left him. He trusted few people in the world, but he trusted Leo Russo implicitly. They had met on a construction site years ago, and Leo was one of the first people who looked at Marcus and saw a man, not a shattered soldier. His loyalty was absolute. Marcus's core ambition was peace. He dreamed of saving enough money to move upstate, buy a small plot of land, and maybe open a little bookstore. He was a voracious reader, a habit he'd picked up in the endless, terrifying quiet between patrols in Vietnam. Books were his escape. His only remaining family was a younger sister, Chloe, who worked as a nurse. He sent her a portion of every dollar he ever made, a silent ritual of protection. He didn't want her to know the details of his life, only that he was looking out for her. He carried a worn St. Christopher medal in his pocket, a gift from her before he was drafted. It was his only superstition. For Marcus, the heist wasn't about the thrill. It was a means to an end, a final violent push towards a life of quiet solitude, away from the ghosts of the past and the noise of the city. He just wanted the silence to be his choice. The final piece of the puzzle was Sammy "Fingers" Goldstein. He was the opposite of Marcus in nearly every way, young, flashy, and brimming with a cocky confidence that bordered on arrogance. At 24, Sammy was a prodigy, a safe-cracker whose delicate touch and intuitive understanding of tumblers and pins were legendary in the underworld. He saw safes not as obstacles, but as puzzles begging to be solved. The money was important, of course, but for Sammy, the real rush was the few minutes of intense, silent communion with a locked steel box. It was the thrill of the win. He drove a slightly too loud Trans Am, wore a gold chain, and was perpetually trying to impress his girlfriend, Rachel, with promises of a glamorous life. His dream was to buy his aging parents a small condominium in Florida, to finally give them the comfortable retirement his father's failing tailor shop never could. He carried a brochure for a Boca Raton development in his jacket pocket, showing it to Rachel with a grin, telling her, "Soon this is us." Sammy provided the specialized skill Leo and Marcus lacked. He was the key. He represented the youthful nerve of the operation. He didn't fully grasp the danger, blinded by the potential reward and his own considerable talent. For him, this was the big score that would catapult him from a gifted punk to a made man, earning him not just money, but respect. These three men, a planner, a protector, and a prodigy, each with their own deeply human reasons, were bound together by a single, high-stakes gamble. They had everything to live for, which made what they were about to do all the more perilous. They were betting their lives and the futures of those they loved on one perfect night. The night of the heist was cold and clear. A sliver of moon hung over the Harlem rooftops, casting long, distorted shadows on the streets below. Leo, Marcus, and Sammy met at a prearranged spot, a derelict alley a few blocks from the Starlight Lounge. The air was thick with a nervous energy. Leo did a final review of the plan, his voice low and steady, a calming anchor in the sea of their anxiety. He had chosen this night specifically. It was a Tuesday, typically the slowest night for the club, and the owner, the notoriously brutal mob boss, Carmine the Bull Gallo, was known to be in Atlantic City for a weekly high-stakes poker game. The plan was built on precision. Marcus, dressed as a city sanitation worker, would take up a position across the street, monitoring police scanners and watching the club's entrance. His signal was a simple one. If he lit a cigarette, the coast was clear. If he dropped it and stamped it out, they had a problem. Leo and Sammy, using forged keys Leo had made from wax impressions supplied by a disgruntled bartender, would enter through a rear service door. Their window was tight, from 2 a.m. after the last staff member left, to 4 a.m. before the morning bakery deliveries began. The first sign of trouble came early. As Marcus took his position, an NYPD patrol car unexpectedly cruised down the block, its headlights sweeping across the alley. The three men froze, melting into the shadows. The car slowed, then continued on its way. Hearts pounded. It was a random patrol, but it was enough to fray their nerves. Inside, the club was eerily silent, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and spilled liquor. The fluorescent lights of the kitchen cast a ghostly glow. Leo moved with a quiet confidence, disabling the rudimentary alarm system on the main floor with a few practiced snips of a wire, just as the blueprints had shown. They descended into the basement, a damp, cluttered space filled with old kegs and boxes. The real target was there. A new top-of-the-line Diebold safe, installed just 6 months prior, was bigger and more formidable than their intel had suggested. This was the second complication. Sammy knelt before it, his bag of tools laid out on a small cloth. He put his stethoscope to the cold steel door, his brow furrowed in concentration. Minutes turned into an eternity. The tumblers weren't falling the way they should. "This model's new," Sammy whispered, a flicker of doubt in his voice. "The pins are shielded." Leo checked his watch. Their timeline was evaporating. Sweat beaded on Sammy's forehead. Above them, they could hear the distant rumble of the subway, a reminder of the city moving on, oblivious to the high-stakes drama unfolding beneath its streets. Marcus, outside, remained a statue of calm, but he could feel the tension radiating from the building. He saw a late-night taxi drop someone off at the end of the block, and his hand instinctively went to the St. Christopher medal in his pocket. Back in the basement, Leo made a risky decision. "We're running out of time. Use the drill." It was a louder, cruder method they had hoped to avoid. Sammy pulled out a small, specialized, diamond-tipped drill. The high-pitched whine, though muffled by the basement's thick walls, sounded like a scream in the silence. He drilled a small hole near the dial, allowing him to use a borescope to see the internal mechanism. The tension was suffocating. Finally, with a soft, satisfying click, the final tumbler fell into place. Sammy wiped his brow and slowly turned the handle. The heavy door swung open. Inside were stacks of cash neatly bundled. They worked fast, stuffing the money into 3 large canvas duffel bags. As they prepared to leave, Leo noticed something odd. On the far wall of the basement, a section of the cinder block looked newer than the rest. The mortar a slightly different shade of gray. It was a recent patch, sloppy work. He filed the insignificant detail away in his mind. It meant nothing. He hefted a bag, the weight of his family's future heavy on his shoulder. They had done it. They moved back up the stairs, retracing their steps. Sammy, high on adrenaline and success, grinned. "Told you," he boasted. "Too easy." It was a fatal miscalculation. As they stepped out of the back door and into the alley, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. Before they could react, more figures emerged, blocking their escape. In that final, terrifying moment, Leo Russo looked past the armed men and saw a familiar face, the bartender who had sold them the key impressions. His face was a mask of pure terror. Leo understood the betrayal just as the world erupted in a flash of violence, a brutal, final ambush that would create a legend and leave behind only questions for the next 45 years. The first person to discover something was wrong wasn't a family member or a police officer. It was the man they had just robbed, Carmine the Bull Gallo. He had returned from Atlantic City earlier than expected, a sour taste in his mouth from a losing night. He arrived at the Starlight Lounge just after sunrise, his mood already foul. Letting himself in, the first thing he noticed was the quiet. Too quiet. His bartender, Johnny, who usually opened up, was nowhere to be seen. A knot of unease tightened in Gallo's stomach. He walked through the silent club, his expensive shoes echoing on the hardwood floor. Everything on the main level was pristine. Nothing was out of place. But his instincts, honed by decades of paranoia and violence, screamed that he had been compromised. He descended to the basement. The moment he saw the safe, his blood ran cold, then hot with a volcanic rage. The door was ajar, swung open like a gaping wound. The inside was cavernous and empty. Nearly $1 million of untaxed illicit cash gone. He didn't roar. He didn't smash anything. A cold, terrifying calm settled over him. This wasn't a random smash and grab. The rest of the club was untouched. The alarms were bypassed cleanly. This was professional. This was an inside job. His first call wasn't to the police. It was to his top enforcer, a hulking man named Rocco. "Get down here." Gallo's voice was a low growl. "We've been hit. No cops. Find Johnny the bartender. Find out who he was talking to. I want names." Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Queens, Maria Russo was starting to worry. Leo had promised to call from a payphone the moment the job was over. A simple "I'm okay," before he and the crew laid low for a few days. The sun was now high in the sky, and the phone remained silent. She tried to tell herself that plans change, that they were just being extra cautious. But a seed of dread was planted. She called Marcus Jones's sister, Chloe. "Have you heard from Marcus?" Maria asked, her voice tight. Chloe's response only deepened the fear. "No," she said. "He always calls me on Wednesday morning. Always." In the Bronx, Sammy Goldstein's girlfriend Rachel woke up alone. Sammy hadn't come home. That wasn't entirely unusual for him, but his prized Trans Am was still parked on the street outside. A car he never would have left behind if he was skipping town. She went to his apartment. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was normal, except for the palpable feeling of absence. On his dresser lay the brochure for the Florida condominium, a cruel reminder of a future that was suddenly in doubt. The families were in an impossible position. They couldn't file missing persons reports. Admitting their loved ones were missing meant admitting who they were and what they likely had been doing. They were trapped in a silent panic, their fear growing with every passing hour. The official investigation was happening in the shadows, led by a furious mob boss, not the NYPD. Days later, a sanitation worker found the crew's intended getaway car, a nondescript Ford sedan, parked on a quiet street in the South Bronx. It had been wiped clean of all fingerprints. The only thing the police, who were called for an abandoned vehicle, found was a single muddy boot print on the pavement next to the driver's side door. It was the only physical clue that the ghost crew of the Starlight Lounge had ever existed. The search for the ghost crew and the missing $1 million began immediately, but it was an investigation that operated entirely outside the law. Carmine Gallo, consumed by a white-hot fury, unleashed his entire organization. His rage was twofold. He had lost a substantial amount of his operating capital, but more importantly, he had been humiliated. Someone had dared to steal from him in his own territory. This was an insult that required a brutal and public correction. His primary suspect was the crew themselves. In his mind, they had succeeded. They had the money and were now living it up somewhere, laughing at him. The thought drove him to the edge of madness. Gallo's men, led by his enforcer Rocco, descended upon the city's underworld like a plague. They shook down every known associate of Leo, Marcus, and Sammy. Low-level bookies were dragged into alleys, fences were questioned with brutal efficiency, and old contacts were given ultimatums: talk or suffer the consequences. The city's criminal element went to ground, terrified of being caught in Gallo's indiscriminate dragnet. This violent, chaotic approach sowed fear but yielded no concrete leads. No one had seen them. No one had heard from them. It was as if the three men had simply stepped off the face of the earth. The families bore the brunt of this shadow investigation. Two of Gallo's thugs visited Maria Russo. They didn't lay a hand on her, but their presence was a suffocating threat. They sat in her living room, their eyes cold and empty, asking where Leo was. They tore her apartment apart, searching for a hidden stash of money. "He'll turn up," one of them said as they left, a statement that was both a promise and a threat. "And when he does, the bull is going to want to talk to him." Maria was left trembling, her daughter Sarah hiding in the bedroom. She was utterly alone, unable to turn to the police for protection from the very men who were hunting her husband. Marcus's sister Chloe faced similar harassment at her apartment, and Sammy's girlfriend was followed for weeks. Their lives became a waking nightmare of paranoia and fear. The search was further complicated by outside forces. A rival mob family, the Falcones, saw Gallo's perceived weakness as an opportunity. They began planting false information, spreading rumors through their network of informants. They whispered that the crew had been spotted in Las Vegas, that a man matching Leo's description had bought a boat in Miami. These calculated lies sent Gallo's men on a series of wild goose chases, wasting time and resources. One such false lead resulted in a bloody shootout in a Philadelphia bar, leaving two of Gallo's men dead and the Falcones one step closer to encroaching on his territory. The failure of Gallo's search was rooted in a fundamental flaw in his own logic. He was looking for living men who had run away with his money. His vast network was geared to find people hiding in other cities, trying to spend large sums of cash. He had his people watching airports, bus stations, and casinos. He never once considered the possibility that the crew had never left Harlem. He never considered that the reason no one could find them was because they were already dead. The NYPD, for their part, were effectively blind to the situation. They had a report of an abandoned car in the Bronx and hushed whispers on the street about the Starlight Lounge job, but nothing concrete. No one had officially been reported missing. Carmine Gallo certainly wasn't talking. Admitting to the police that he kept $1 million in cash in his basement safe was out of the question. The case was a ghost. There was no body, no crime scene, no complainant. For the authorities, the disappearance of Leo Russo, Marcus Jones, and Sammy Goldstein simply never happened. As weeks turned into months, Gallo's frantic search slowed to a bitter, frustrated simmer. The trail went ice cold. The men and the money were gone. The years that followed were heavy with a silence that was more agonizing than any truth could have been. The case of the ghost crew went from a hot underworld topic to a cold, forgotten mystery. For the families, life moved on, but it was a life forever altered, lived in the shadow of an unanswered question. Maria Russo raised Sarah on her own, a fortress of maternal strength built on a foundation of quiet grief. She took a job as a seamstress, working long hours to provide for her daughter. She told Sarah that her father was a traveling salesman who had gone on a very long trip and never came back. It was a kinder fiction than the terrifying uncertainty she lived with every day. For years, she would startle at the sound of a late-night phone call or a car slowing on her street, a residual tremor of the terror Gallo's men had inflicted upon her. The hope of seeing Leo walk through the door faded, replaced by a desperate, gnawing need just to know what had happened to him. Had he been killed? Did he run away? The not knowing was a unique form of torture. Marcus Jones's sister, Chloe, was haunted by his absence. The weekly calls had been a lifeline, and their abrupt end left a void in her life. She eventually moved out of the city, trying to escape the memories and the lingering fear. She passed away from cancer in the late 1990s, never learning the fate of the brother who had tried so hard to protect her. Sammy Goldstein's parents refused to believe their son was a high-level thief. In their minds, he was a good boy who had fallen in with the wrong crowd and met a terrible end. They passed away within a few years of each other, their dream of a Florida retirement buried with them. His girlfriend Rachel eventually married, had children, and moved on, but the ghost of the flashy, confident boy with the Florida brochure never entirely left her. In the criminal world of New York, the story of the Starlight Lounge heist became the stuff of legend. It was a cautionary tale told in hushed tones in smoky bars. Some said the crew had successfully pulled off the perfect crime and were living on a beach in Mexico. Others whispered that Gallo had found them and fed them to the fishes in Sheepshead Bay. A darker, more popular theory was that the crew had turned on each other in a dispute over the money, a bloody end in some forgotten alley. The missing $980,000 became a mythical treasure, a lost Harlem fortune. The Starlight Lounge itself went through several transformations. It was sold by a disgruntled Carmine Gallo in the early 80s. It became a disco, then a hip-hop club, and finally, a derelict, boarded-up eyesore. The basement, where the heist had taken place, was used for storage by a succession of owners, none of whom ever paid any mind to the slightly discolored patch of mortar on the far wall. The legend of the ghost crew became part of the neighborhood's grim folklore, a story about greed and disappearance. For 45 years, 3 men remained frozen in time, their fate a permanent, aching mystery that pulsed beneath the surface of the city, a testament to the brutal finality of the underworld and the profound, rippling impact of a single night of violence. For 45 years, the secret remained sealed in concrete and silence. The world changed, New York City transformed, and the ghost crew faded from memory into myth. The catalyst that would finally break the silence was not a detective's hunch or a long-awaited confession. It was the raw, indiscriminate power of nature. In the late summer of 2024, a Category 4 hurricane, ironically named Hurricane Leo, churned up the Atlantic coast. It was a monster storm, one that the city had braced for but was still unprepared to handle. It made landfall with a terrifying fury, unleashing torrential rains and a devastating storm surge that inundated low-lying areas. Harlem, like much of the city, was hit hard. Streets turned into rivers, and old, neglected buildings bore the brunt of the storm's wrath. Among the casualties was the long-condemned structure that had once been the Starlight Lounge. Decades of neglect had made it vulnerable. The hurricane's deluge flooded the basement, saturating the foundation for days. The water pressure, combined with the battering winds, weakened the ancient structure to its breaking point. City inspectors, surveying the widespread damage in the storm's aftermath, quickly red-tagged the building. It was deemed an imminent collapse hazard, a danger to the public. An emergency demolition order was issued. A week later, a demolition crew arrived on the scene. The work was routine, another crumbling piece of old New York making way for the new. A heavy-jawed excavator began to methodically chew away at the building's exterior. The main structure came down in a controlled cloud of dust and debris. All that remained was the foundation and the basement walls. A wrecking ball was brought in to finish the job. The operator, a young man named Javier, swung the massive steel ball towards the rear basement wall. It struck the concrete with a deafening crack, but instead of just powdering the surface, something unexpected happened. A large section of the cinder block wall didn't just crumble, it collapsed inward, revealing a dark, hidden cavity behind it. The impact had shattered a seal that had held for nearly half a century. Work stopped. The crew gathered at the edge of the newly formed hole, peering into the darkness. A foul, musty odor, the smell of time and decay wafted out. Javier grabbed a powerful flashlight from his truck and aimed its beam into the void. The light cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene frozen in time. He saw the rotted, canvas-like material of old duffel bags, their contents spilled out and decayed. He saw the rusted metallic shapes of old hand tools and firearms, and then he saw something that made his blood run cold. Protruding from the dirt and debris was the unmistakable yellowed curve of a human skull, then another, and another. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Call the cops," he yelled, his voice shaking. "Call the cops right now." The pivotal moment had arrived. In the rubble of a forgotten nightclub, a 45-year-old mystery had just been violently wrenched back into the present day. The ghosts of the Starlight Lounge were about to speak. The call from the demolition site lit up the switchboard at the 32nd Precinct and was quickly routed to the NYPD's cold case squad. The discovery of multiple human remains at a single site was a major event, and the city's best investigators were dispatched. The case file, such as it was, landed on the desk of Detective Isabella Rossi. Rossi was the antithesis of the old-school, cigar-chomping detectives of the 1970s. She was sharp, tech-savvy, and relentless, with a reputation for seeing patterns in chaos. She arrived at the scene, a secured perimeter buzzing with forensic activity. The atmosphere was electric. This wasn't just a crime scene, it was a time capsule. Rossi oversaw the painstaking excavation of the hidden compartment. It was a small, crudely sealed chamber, barely large enough for 3 men to stand in. The forensic team worked for hours, carefully extracting every piece of evidence. They recovered 3 complete human skeletons, their clothes long since rotted away to nothing. They found 3 heavily corroded handguns and a collection of rusted safe-cracking tools, including a specialized drill bit that matched the hole in the old Diebold safe, which was still half buried in the rubble nearby. And then there was the money. 3 canvas duffel bags, mostly disintegrated, had spilled their contents. The cash was a pulpy, water-damaged mess, but through forensic recovery, they could identify the straps from the First National Bank and the 1970s-era currency. It was all there: the crew, the tools, and the treasure. The first step was identification. The world of forensics had changed completely since 1979. Rossi's team extracted degraded DNA from the femurs of all 3 skeletons. They ran the profiles through the national database but got no hits. These men had no criminal record in the modern system. Rossi then took a different tack. She pulled the original thin file on the abandoned getaway car from 1979 and the old street rumors about the Starlight Lounge heist. The names Leo Russo, Marcus Jones, and Sammy Goldstein came up. She knew that finding relatives was their best shot. Her team tracked down Leo Russo's only child, a woman named Sarah, now in her early 50s and living in New Jersey. A DNA sample confirmed a familial match. The first skeleton was Leo Russo. They found a grandnephew of Marcus Jones living in Albany. His DNA confirmed the second skeleton was the silent Vietnam vet. Finally, using old dental records from a Bronx dentist, they positively identified the third skeleton as Sammy Fingers Goldstein. The ghost crew had been found. The who was solved. Now for the what happened. The initial theory on site was a classic trope: a deal gone wrong, a shootout in the basement over the loot. But the forensic evidence told a different story. The medical examiner found that all 3 victims had been shot multiple times. The ballistics unit recovered several .38 caliber slugs from the remains and the surrounding walls. Crucially, all the bullets had been fired from the same 2 weapons, neither of which matched the 3 corroded guns found with the bodies. Furthermore, the bullet trajectories were all consistent. The shots had come from the front, from a single direction, as if the victims were facing their killers. This wasn't a chaotic shootout. It was an execution. They had been ambushed. The central question became, who sealed them in the wall? This is where Detective Rossi's meticulous nature shone. She remembered the initial report from the demolition crew, how the wall had collapsed inward. It was a sealed compartment, not a natural part of the structure. She ordered a forensic analysis of the mortar used to seal the cinder blocks. The lab came back with a fascinating result. It was a custom mix, a specific ratio of sand, cement, and a waterproofing additive that was uncommon for the time. This was the key. Rossi put her team to work, digging through the city's archaic, microfilmed construction permit archives from 1978 and 1979. It was a painstaking process, but they got a hit. The specific mortar mix had been purchased in bulk by a single contractor in Harlem. That contractor's primary client in 1979 was none other than Carmine the Bull Gallo, for a series of renovations on his private properties. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Rossi found Carmine Gallo, now 90 years old, living in a quiet nursing home in Queens. He was a frail, shrunken version of the feared mob boss, a man seemingly lost to time and dementia. Rossi and her partner sat down with him in the sterile, sunlit room. He was initially dismissive, his memory supposedly foggy. But Rossi didn't press him about the murders. She talked about construction. She talked about the Starlight Lounge. She talked about the specific waterproof mortar mix he had used. She laid out the evidence with cold, clinical precision. The ambush-style ballistics, the custom mortar, the fact that the crew's inside man, a bartender named Johnny Ciccone, had also vanished without a trace in the same week. She painted a picture for him, a picture of Gallo, waiting in the shadows of his own basement, of him watching the crew do the hard work, opening the safe for him. And then, he and his men stepping out to deliver judgment. Gallo was silent for a long time, his roomy eyes staring out the window. The facade of the senile old man began to crumble, replaced by a flicker of the old cold arrogance. "They thought they were smart," he finally rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "But they were stupid. Amateurs." He confessed everything. He confirmed the bartender had tipped him off. Gallo decided not to just stop them, he would make them an example. He and Rocco were waiting. They executed the crew the moment they had the money in hand. "The best safe is a wall," Gallo sneered, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "No one ever thinks to look inside a wall." He admitted to mixing the mortar and laying the blocks himself. It was his personal trophy case. He didn't care about the money. He cared about the power of making 3 men and $1 million disappear forever. The 45-year-old mystery was solved. The what, the who, and the where were finally known. All that was left was the why. The confession of Carmine Gallo sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community, a stunning resolution to a case that was pure folklore. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of legal and emotional reckoning. Arrests were made, though the primary target was already a captive of old age. Gallo was formally charged with 3 counts of murder. His enforcer, Rocco, had died of a heart attack in the 1990s, taking his role in the slaughter to the grave. The focus of the investigation now shifted from what happened to fully understanding the chilling why. Gallo's motive, as he elaborated in further interviews with Detective Rossi, was a terrifying cocktail of pure narcissistic rage and calculated long-term strategy. It was never just about the money. To him, the $90,000 to $80,000 was replaceable. His pride was not. The idea that a small independent crew led by a construction worker could successfully breach his fortress and steal from him was an intolerable insult. In the rigid, brutal hierarchy of the mob, perception was reality. If word got out that the bull could be so easily robbed, his enemies would smell blood in the water. His reign of fear would be compromised. He didn't just want to kill them, he wanted to erase them. By making them vanish, he authored the narrative. The legend of the Ghost Crew, which he secretly cultivated through rumors, served as a far more potent deterrent than 3 bodies in a morgue ever could. It created an aura of almost supernatural power around him. Did he get them? Did they turn on each other? The uncertainty was the point. It told everyone in the underworld that if you crossed Carmine Gallo, you didn't just die, you ceased to exist. It was the ultimate power play. The inside man, the bartender Johnny Ciccone, was the final loose end. Gallo admitted that after the murders, he had taken Johnny for a ride. He was a liability who knew too much. Rossi's team reopened an unsolved John Doe case from 1979, a body found in the marshes of New Jersey. With the new context from Gallo's confession, they were able to tentatively identify the remains as Johnny Ciccone, another victim of Gallo's cold-blooded housecleaning. As for the legal consequences, they were largely symbolic. Gallo was deemed medically unfit to stand trial. His body was failing, his mind a flickering light. He was transferred to a secure medical ward, where he died of natural causes less than a month after his confession. There would be no dramatic courtroom showdown, no verdict from a jury of his peers. Justice, in its traditional sense, was denied by the simple passage of time. The fate of the money was equally anticlimactic. The cash recovered from the wall was meticulously dried and examined by forensic accountants and experts from the U.S. Treasury. After 45 years of damp and decay, most of it was unsalvageable, a pulpy mass of rotten paper. A small fraction, perhaps less than $50,000 of the original $980,000, was preserved. But it wasn't a treasure to be claimed. It was evidence in a quadruple homicide case, and ultimately, it was taken into federal custody as the proceeds of a crime. The great Harlem fortune, the mythical treasure that had fueled decades of speculation, had been reduced to a few stacks of brittle, smelly bills in an evidence locker. The grand conspiracy was laid bare. A simple betrayal, a brutal ambush, and a secret kept by one man's monumental pride, all of which unraveled because of a storm and a piece of shoddy masonry. The truth, when it finally emerged, was simpler and more savage than any of the legends it had spawned. The resolution of the case reverberated far beyond the sterile confines of evidence rooms and legal offices. It landed with profound weight upon the descendants of the men who had vanished. The story returned to its human core, to the families who had lived in a state of suspended grief for nearly half a century. Detective Isabella Rossi felt a personal responsibility to deliver the news herself. Her first visit was to Sarah Russo. Sarah, now a quiet suburban mother, had built a life on the fragile foundation of a lie her mother had told to protect her. She had spent her entire life believing her father was a man who had simply left and never looked back. The anger and sense of abandonment had shaped her in ways she was only now beginning to understand. Rossi sat with her in her kitchen, the same kind of kitchen Leo had dreamed of providing, and gently explained the truth. She told her about the heist, the ambush, and the discovery in the wall. Then she placed a small evidence bag on the table. Inside was a simple gold wedding band, cleaned of 45 years of grime. It was Leo Russo's. Sarah stared at the ring, her father's ring, and the composure she had maintained her entire life shattered. The tears were not just for the father she never knew, but for the man he actually was. Not a deserter, but a man who had died trying to build a better life for her. The grief was immense, but woven through it was a strange, powerful sense of relief. He hadn't abandoned her. He had been stolen from her. The knowledge was a painful gift, an answer that finally allowed a 45-year-old wound to begin to heal. For the family of Marcus Jones, the news brought clarity to a lifetime of inherited sorrow. His sister Chloe had passed away, but Rossi's team located her two children, Marcus's niece and nephew. They had grown up with the faint, sad memory of a mother who always seemed to be waiting for a phone call that never came. They knew their uncle only through a few faded photographs of a serious-looking young man in an army uniform. Learning the truth of his loyalty to his friends and his violent end gave them a context for their mother's quiet sadness. It was closure, not for them directly, but for the memory of their mother and the silent, watchful uncle they had never met. The story of Sammy Goldstein reached his old girlfriend, Rachel, through a news article she saw online. Now, a grandmother living in Arizona, she read the details of the discovery, of the ambush, of the arrogant mob boss. She felt a pang of sadness for the flashy, confident boy she had loved, the boy who had promised her a house in the sun. He was foolish and reckless, but he didn't deserve to be sealed in a wall. The news didn't change her life, but it closed a chapter she hadn't even realized was still open. The remains of Leo Russo, Marcus Jones, and Sammy Goldstein were released to their families. There were no grand funerals, only small, private ceremonies. 3 simple headstones finally gave a name and a place to the ghosts who had haunted Harlem for so long. The waiting was over. The story of the ghost crew of the Starlight Lounge ultimately became more than just a solved cold case. It evolved into a powerful parable about the nature of time, secrets, and justice. Its legacy was not in the rotted money or the death of an old mobster, but in the profound themes it illuminated. Foremost among them was the corrosive power of a secret. Carmine Gallo's act of burying 3 men was not a single event. It was the beginning of a poison that seeped into the lives of dozens of people over nearly 5 decades. It condemned families to a purgatory of not knowing, forcing a wife to lie to her daughter, a sister to live in perpetual anxiety, and parents to die with a hole in their hearts. The case served as a stark reminder that the truth, no matter how brutal, is almost always preferable to the agony of uncertainty. It demonstrated that a secret kept by one man's pride could ripple outward, creating waves of suffering that would span generations. The narrative also served as a profound meditation on the illusion of power. In his own mind, Carmine Gallo had achieved the perfect crime and asserted his ultimate dominance. Sealing his victims in a concrete tomb was his monument to his own ruthlessness, a secret he believed he alone controlled. He thought he had defeated them, that he had imposed his will upon history itself. But in the end, his carefully constructed fortress of silence was brought down by forces far beyond his control. A hurricane, a random act of nature, and the simple, inexorable march of time that weakens all structures, exposed his secret to the light. His power was a mirage. Time, not Gallo, had the final say. His legacy was not one of terrifying strength, but of a pathetic old man in a nursing home, whose greatest secret was unearthed by a rainstorm. The case left a tangible legacy within the NYPD as well. The successful use of forensic genealogy combined with the painstaking search of archaic municipal archives created a new template for impossible cases. Detective Rossi's Mortar Clue inspired a new initiative within the Cold Case Squad, a program to cross-reference missing persons reports from the 70s and 80s with building permits and construction records from the same period, looking for anomalies. It was a long shot, but the Starlight Lounge case proved that sometimes the clue to a man's disappearance isn't in a witness statement, but in a bag of cement. It was a testament to the idea that no case is ever truly cold, and no secret is ever buried deep enough to escape the relentless search for truth. 3 men went looking for a fortune and found a tomb, their silence enforced by a mobster's pride for 45 years, until a storm unearthed a secret that time could not erase. This story is a powerful reminder that the past is never truly gone, and that justice, even when delayed for decades, can find its way to the surface in the most unexpected ways. If this story of a crime frozen in time resonated with you, and you appreciate deep dives into mysteries that were once thought to be unsolvable, be sure to like this video and share it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true crime investigations. We want to hear your thoughts on this incredible case. Do you believe Carmine Gallo acted alone with just his enforcer? Or were others in his organization involved who managed to get away with it? Tell us in the comments what you believe really happened.